clearing of adenosine from the brain. Wake up. Types. So these are some of the different for evening chronotypes, because this means that their body is not sleeping on the schedule that it would them disruption, which we see literature that evening chronotypes tend to have higher resting blood pressure, obesity, lower physical activity levels, poorer diets, and higher blood glucose levels. And we see all of these factors are indicators of cardiovascular disease, or could turn into cardiovascular disease. Now, our hypothesis specifically is, or our research question specifically is asking about, do these trends hold true in younger adults? Is there cardiovascular health differences in younger adults by chronotype? We're looking at this population specifically because there is research for those older than 40 years old, but for those under 40 years old, there is only a little research, and what there is quite inconsistent. So we want to look into that specifically. And our hypothesis is that evening chronotypes will have poorer cardiovascular health indices, which would be indicators of cardiovascular risk. Now let's get into the methods that we're using. Before I do so, though, I want to acknowledge that this is an ongoing study. We are still collecting data and analyzing variables. So in this presentation, I'm just analyzing the current participants that we've collected on and a few markers that we've collected for. Our population that we've recruited are young adults, younger than 40 years old, and inclusion and exclusion criteria. Once we've screened them, they fill out a reduced morning and eveningness questionnaire, which stratifies them by chronotype. And then they all come into the lab and have the same lab procedures done with them. Now, I'm not going to walk through exactly all of these lab procedures, but I want to highlight the two that I will be pulling data for this presentation. I'm looking at the body composition and the 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure data specifically. We also have collected data, though, on other measures, though I am not analyzing them today in this presentation. Our statistical analysis, as you'll see in a second, we have had the sample is characterized by means and standard deviations, and then we used a one-way ANOVA to compare cardiovascular health markers by chronotype, and any differences or trending differences have been highlighted on the graphs themselves. So let's get into first the sample demographics. As you can see, our average age is 20 years old, and the vast majority of our participants are women. Their heart markers, their blood pressure and augmentation index are all within healthy ranges, though our body mass index, the average is in the overweight category. So that is interesting to note. Getting into more specifics, I just want to highlight that of the sample I'm pulling from, we have 37 participants, and 54% of them are intermediate, meaning that there are not a ton of participants in the morning and evening chronotypes categories thus far. We also see that in obesity measures that there are obese populations in the intermediate and morning chronotypes, but not in the evening. We also see hypertension and elevated blood pressure in the intermediate and morning chronotypes and not in the evening. And I point this out because this is the opposite of what we would expect out of a sample that we have pulled. Okay, let's look at our results specifically. We looked at influence of chronotype on obesity, and we found no difference between evening and morning chronotype, though we do have trending differences between evening and intermediate, with actually the intermediate having the higher BMI than the evening chronotype. We then looked at the influence of chronotype on ambulatory systolic blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure is the pressure in your heart when your heart is contracting, and we found no difference between the chronotypes. We looked at diastolic blood pressure. Diastolic is when your heart is at rest in between contractions, and we found no difference between the chronotypes. And then finally, we looked at the influence of chronotype on arterial stiffness. Arterial stiffness, as your arteries get more stiff, your blood pressure increases, and this is a cardiovascular risk. So we would want to see lower arterial stiffness. And we do in fact see that morning chronotypes at rest have a lower arterial stiffness than intermediate chronotypes, which is in line with our hypothesis. So in conclusion, I want to remind you once again of our research question. Did the markers of cardiovascular health differ by chronotype in young adults? And these are the conclusions that I just went over. You may be thinking, well, it doesn't seem to support your hypothesis. And why is this the case? Well, I do want to remind you that we only have a small sample size thus far. We have about 50% of the participants that we are hoping to continue to collect data on. And the majority of them are evening chronotypes currently. We focused on only a few markers for this presentation, but we've also collected on many other markers from all of the participants that have come in thus far. So we're going to continue to analyze that data. Our future directions, I'll briefly go over these. We're going to continue to have participants come in, and we're specifically going to look for evening and morning chronotypes just so that we can increase the statistical power of our comparisons there. And then we're also going to analyze the other physiological measures that we have gotten information on and see if there's any trends with the evening chronotypes and cardiovascular risk indices. So thank you for listening, and I'm now open to any questions if you all have some.
So we talk about different types of chronotypes, and one of the factors that you mentioned was genetic. When people move across the world, obviously they adapt to different light cycles, different schedules, and there's jet lag and stuff. Is it possible for one chronotype to kind of shift into a different chronotype in the same location, or are you going to be an evening chronotype no matter what your schedule looks like?
I believe because chronotype is just your behavioral response to what's biologically going on with you. So you do have an internal clock, and that is due to genetic factors that I mentioned. But you also have Zeitgebers, which I mentioned too, which are your external cues. So yes, as you are having shifts in your external cues, and maybe your body responds particularly well to sun coming through your window in the morning, and that stimulates your body a lot more than it might to another person, then yeah, maybe you could shift to being a morning chronotype. So yes, your response, your behavioral response can change. You can shift from morning to intermediate depending on the circumstances and the external cues that are going on. Though at the same time, there are genetic and internal factors that also play a role.
So when you were speaking about the stresses involved in modern life, you mentioned a lot of morning stresses, but when I think about young people around 20, I'm thinking about college students, which have a lot more night stresses, going out, partying maybe. So do you see that a lot of your samples is students who may have different stresses than the average American?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a good point. It's one of the reasons why we may not have the trends that we see in middle or older age adults, because college students are at a unique period in time where they can sleep in, they can stay up really late. They don't have as rigid of a structure as most adults do. And so, yes, I definitely think that influences our data because of how college students may stay up late and have nighttime stressors as opposed to the average American's early rise and having to be at work.